Okay, for today's video, I want to talk about speed, sound separately, then the speed of sound together. And let's try to figure out why a deer has the ability to drop below the flight of your arrow. Okay, to start off with, let's just kind of go back in time and look at some history. This is probably 15, 20 years ago, at least, maybe longer than that. I can remember when the speed craze really hit, and that was during the days when people were using overdraws, extending the shelf on their bow and cutting their arrows off to 25, 24 inches long if they could get away with it. So then you got the broadhead all the way back here. And I know from the IBO standards, they use a 70-pound bow, 30-inch draw length, and 5 grains per pound of draw weight. So when they shoot all the new bows and they get the feet per second, that's with a 350 grain arrow, okay? And quite honestly, that's a little too light. That's probably excessively too light for deer hunting, and especially elk or anything bigger. So you got to remember that 350 is not a hunting setup or bow hunter setup, BHS. It's not a bow hunter setup. And I'm shooting 500 grains approximately. I'm shooting a 150 grain tip. So I'm going more to a slower arrow, but more momentum. We can talk kinetic energy, or we can talk momentum. Both of them help, but from what I've seen and the math that I've done, it's based on momentum. So you can take a look at that. A case in point is, get you a 50, 100-pound bag of sand, shoot your 22 rifle bullet into that bag of sand. The bullet probably will not come out the other side. And then go back and shoot your arrow, and the arrow will go through it. It's the difference in weight. So when you look at the speed of the bows that are being produced, remember that is not a hunter's setup. Okay, that is just a national standard from the IBO, where they can universally measure all bows equally at the same level, with the same weight, same grains, and same draw length. Okay, so for bow hunters, we got to take it one step further and try to understand, okay, the hide thickness, the thickness of the animal, bone structure, things like that. What we need to be doing to provide a humane, lethal kill. And that's one of the things you got to realize is, when we do this, when we're hunting, what's your primary goal? Well, my primary goal isn't a flat trajectory. My primary goal is to provide a humane, lethal kill. Okay? If you've been on some of those long track jobs or some of the ones that went overnight, that's no fun for you, but not to mention it's even worse for the deer, because you want the deer to expire as quickly as possible. So I can remember all that speed craze going on, and archers were out there getting that flat trajectory, and then you're losing your energy, point of impact, you're losing that pass-through ability and the ability to go through bone if you need to. Of course, a lot of that depends on the type of broadhead you're using, but that's another video altogether. I want to stay focused on the speed, the sound, and then the speed of sound. So what we're going to talk about is, we're going to talk about the fact that with the need for a flatter trajectory, the speeds went up, okay? And sometimes with speeds going up, you produce a louder bow. So I'm talking speed, now I'm talking sound. We know how acute a deer's hearing is, right? So with the deer's exceptional hearing, when you go to a faster bow, which means it's producing more energy, and you have a lighter arrow, then the arrow's not able to absorb all that energy. The energy's got to go somewhere. So it's going into your wheels, your cams, your string, your limbs, your quiver. It's going into the riser. It's going wherever it can go. Okay, and that generates sound. Okay, so then the deer can hear that sound. All right. So when the deer hears that sound, they're reacting to it. It's an unnatural sound, and we all know deer were created to do certain things based on instinct. That's God's way of programming characteristics in the animals. You can't see it, but it's there. Birds build nests, beavers build dams. They all do that for a reason, and it's called instinct. And when a deer hears something that's unnatural, and when you shoot your bow, that's an unnatural sound, it's jumping, preparing to jump, I should say. It's actually lowering itself and loading its legs to spring forward and get out of harm's way. So it feels like it's going to evade a predator. If you remember all those African shows where you got the impalas and gazelles out on the African plain, and they're all looking around for cheetahs, Some are feeding and some are looking around. And then they kind of alternate. The ones that were feeding, they'll pop their head up and look around, test the wind, listen. Deer are no different. They are a prey animal, so they're always on the lookout for predators. So that's something you got to remember is the speed of your bow, the speed of your bow versus the sound that it makes. And I can go ahead and tell you, bows are not supersonic. They're not flying with the speed of a bullet. Bullets actually making contact before you hear the sound, because they're flying 2 to 3 times faster than the speed of sound. So bows aren't doing that. Well, not yet anyway. So I haven't seen a vapor cloud behind an arrow yet. So you got to remember that. Focus on the areas of the bow that you can improve the most to minimize a deer's ability to hear and react to this unnatural sound. Okay, so now we're going to go take a look at a little bit of math. Okay, let me get my release off here. All right, so let's kind of go back and review just a little bit when we were outside shooting our bow and doing all that practicing. Basically, what I want to talk about is it speed, sound, or the speed of sound that gives a deer an advantage when we shoot? Now, I can remember when I first started bow hunting, I was basically self-taught, but a lot of the old school guys always advocated shooting a little lower than your primary target point to try to compensate for the deer dropping, okay? So when you look at the physics behind how a deer can react to your shot, you'll understand it. So, we talked about, 15, 20 years ago, speed was the #1 priority. We want to get a flat trajectory, use that one pin, 30, 40 yards, as far as we can go with it. And there's no adjusting, there's no guesswork. So that made things a little simpler. But at the same time, you went to a lighter arrow. Remember, there's a big difference between IBO speed rating of a manufacturer's bow versus the BHS, or your bow hunting setup. The arrow setup that you need to humanely and lethally harvest the animal. And that's my primary goal. I don't want a 4-hour track job, and I definitely don't want an overnight track job where you got to wait till the next morning and go in. Not good for you, definitely not good for the deer. So bearing in mind that #1 priority, that we want to harvest that deer as lethally and humanely as possible, I want to get my arrow to the deer in the exact spot every time, okay? So does speed have a greater impact on that, sound, or the speed of sound? So we talked about the overdraws. I think those have come and gone, thankfully. I never got into the overdraw. Never did like the idea of having a broadhead behind my wrist. But as I was saying outside is, once you go to a lighter setup, the arrow is not heavy enough to absorb the energy of the bow. And that energy is going to dissipate somewhere else, okay? And it resonates in sound. It produces sound, okay? And sound is what gives the deer an advantage over us shooting. So what I want to talk about right now is, and hopefully we can see this on the chart, and hopefully my math is right, okay? But anyway, I'm going to use my bow as an example, and we're going to go in and look at the speed of sound. And for all you history buffs out there, Chuck Yeager broke the speed of sound back in October of 1947. I think it was in the X1. So the speed of sound has been broken for, a long time. But as bow hunters, we need to understand how that impacts us when we draw back and release an arrow on a deer, okay? Okay, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit. I'm going to talk a little bit more in depth about the speed of sound. And, as I mentioned earlier, Chuck Yeager broke that in 1947. And, the title of this video is Speed or Sound, or the speed of sound. And that's what we want to get to. And I'm not going to go through the whole process of how I got how many feet per second the speed of sound is. I mean, you could type it in on the internet and it can give you the answer really quick. But what I want to do is I want to be able to convey the speed of sound and how important it is to bow hunters, since we're shooting something that is not supersonic. There's not an arrow out there that I have seen, nor will they be probably, that we shoot from a bow that's going to have a vapor cone or a shot caller behind it. It's just not going to happen. So we're not shooting faster than bullets. So we got to realize the fact that the sound is going to get to the deer faster than our arrow will, okay? So I'm going to use, in this example, I'm going to use my bow and the feet per second that I'm getting to show and demonstrate how much faster the sound is actually getting there. Because a lot of times, like, as I said before, people talk about deer jumping the string and doing different things. All the deer are doing is what they were created to do. This is instinct kicking in. They are a prey animal, just like I mentioned when we're outside shooting. You look at the gazelles and the impalas; they're always looking around for lions and cheetahs. They're looking for the predators. Well, the deer is no different. So when it hears an unnatural sound like the one produced from our bows, it is just using its instinct to evade a predator, and it's dropping. So a deer's back, well, actually the deer's body will just drop as it crouches and loads its legs. The legs are acting just like springs. And it's getting energy from its legs, so it's dropping to jump and evade the predator. So that's why it's so important. So look at this real quick. 761 miles per hour. If you look it up on the internet, you might get 2 or 3 different answers. I got this from NASA. This is at sea level. There's a lot of different variables that can change that number a little bit, but for us, we're going to use 761. Okay, you guys probably remember the algebraic formula back in college or high school: distance, rate, and time. I use that to generate how many feet per second the speed of sound is, and then that way I can compare it to how fast my bow is shooting. So after I went through all the math here, and I converted the hours to seconds and the miles to feet, I got the speed of sound is actually 1,116 feet per second. Okay? So if you think about it, there's 300 feet and 100 yards, so almost 3 football fields or 4 football fields a second. So that's moving. Now how fast is my bow in comparison to the sound? Okay? Well, in this example I'm using my bow, and for those of you who don't know, I shoot an older model bow. It can kill deer just as dead as a 2022 bow. And I just haven't felt the need to upgrade. But I shoot a 2002 Matthews SQ2. And my BHS, and that's what I'm calling it, that's my new acronym, Bow Hunters setup versus the IBO. Remember, the IBO is 70 pounds, 30-inch draw, 5 grains per pound. So they're shooting a 350 grain arrow, standard for all bow manufacturers, so they can compare the feet per second. But for hunters, that's not going to work. You got to have a heavier arrow. So I'm in that 500 grain range. So when I shot mine through the chronograph, it's right around that 270 mark, and I'm good with that. Okay. So I'm shooting 270 feet per second. I divide that into 1,116 feet per second, which is the speed of sound, and the sound of my release and the bow and everything else involved, all the mechanics, is getting to the deer 4.13 times faster than my arrow. So the bottom line is the sound reaches the deer, in my example, over 4 times faster. So that's giving that deer the opportunity. If I use this as the stomach and this is the back, it hears that unnatural sound, it's dropping. It's going to load its legs, it's going to take off and run to evade the predator. So that's what you got to remember. So when I look at this and I start thinking about, brainstorming on how I could present this information in the video, is it speed that we need? Is it sound reduction? That's why I said speed or sound. Or is it being able to defeat the speed of sound? And from my standpoint and the things that I have looked at objectively, it's the speed of sound we need to defeat and sound. Forget the speed of your bow. You're not going to shoot faster than the speed of sound, okay? So, yeah, I understand the trajectory. I understand the one pin mentality. I understand all that. And I understand the fact, too, that you can generate some kinetic energy. But I urge you to do the math on it and go back and look at some engineering examples. Momentum is what we need. You need a heavier arrow to pass through things. It's not just the kinetic energy. So there's a formula for momentum also. So when you look at that, you can't go faster than the speed of sound. That's a losing battle. So let's just forget that. But what we can work on is the sound of our bow in order to minimize. We're not going to be able to completely defeat the speed of sound, but let's minimize that sound because we know it's going to get to the deer faster. And all they're doing is using their God-given instinct. They're evading the predator and they're taking off. They don't know you've got a bow in your hand. They don't know you've got an arrow. They don't know anything. All they know is they heard something, it's unnatural, and they're going to try to evade the predator. So let's focus on the sound. So what I'm going to do for the next video or two, we're going to work on just using my old bow as an example, and we're going to do certain things, go through certain nuances. And what I did was I downloaded a decibel meter on my phone, and it records, so I can go back and look at the grass, and we'll see how much lower we can get the decibels on our bow. Now, I did some brainstorming too, and there's probably a couple more things that we can do to maybe minimize the effect of the speed of sound, and we'll talk about those as well. So in the meantime, take a look at your bow when you shoot. And obviously, you know, a lot of people are upgrading this year. You know, maybe there's a bow out there that's got an IBO rating of, I don't know, 320, 330. But just remember, when you set your bow up to hunt, it's not going to be the IBO that counts. It's going to be that BHS. It's going to be that bow hunting setup. The weight of your hunting arrow is going to determine the speed of your bow. And as I said before, the heavier the arrow you go, now obviously you got to have the right spine arrow for the, I mean, there's 6 different things, I think, based on, you know, your length, your draw length, the bow weight, the cam wheel design, the tip of your arrow, your string, your release. All those things go in combined to determine what type of spine to shoot. Okay, so I believe I'm shooting a 300 spine arrow, so it's a heavy arrow, and I'm trying, like I said, to achieve that momentum so I can have the energy to pass through the deer. Plus, I've got a broadhead that I believe that if I encounter bone, because we don't always shoot perfect, and that's another thing to think about. On that speed of sound, that deer is already moving before your arrow gets there. The deer's already dropping. So that will actually exaggerate any error that you've got. Okay? If you are high already on your shot, you may shoot right over the deer's back. All right, so we still got to concentrate on shooting our bows accurately. We got to concentrate on picking the spot, you know, being as quiet and stealthy as we can. But at the same time, if you just look at things objectively, you're not going to shoot faster than the speed of sound. Sound is always going to get to the deer faster. So we as hunters have got to come up with a better strategy on how to get our arrow to the deer without it alarming or spooking it. So we're going to keep working toward that. The next video, we're going to be outside, and I'm going to have my decibel meter set up and ready to go. We're going to do some shots. We're going to make a few changes to my bow, see if we can't get that decibel meter down. And then we're also going to discuss these other things that I brainstormed on how you can minimize the impact of speed of sound so your deer does not duck the arrow. Because remember, the deer is just reacting to the unnatural sound of your bow. So let's minimize that impact. You know, if you can get the deer where it's just completely not alarmed, it's concentrating somewhere else. And I've done it before and they didn't move it at all. And the arrow was just dead center, heart shot, you know, no problems. That's great. But that's 1 in 100 probably. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Don't forget to hit the like button. Make sure you subscribe. And we'll see you next time.